Buildings, coastlines, and northern communities are most at risk from the effects of climate change. That's according to a new report conducted at the request of the Federal Treasury Board. The report identifies 12 areas of risk and highlights 6 that will be most affected. It ranks them by the magnitude of the threat and also by the availability of remedies. At the top of the list is infrastructure. Buildings from homes to hospitals are increasingly threatened by heavy rains and floods. Coastal communities come next as climate change is slowly raising sea levels. Northerners are third most at risk as permafrost melts away underneath them and climate change threatens their way of life. Next, human health. That includes injuries and death from extreme weather events. Ecosystems rank number 5, which includes potential loss of biodiversity. And finally, fisheries are a concern due to things like warmer water temperatures and lower water quality and flooding. So how will the government respond to this report, and how will it determine mitigation priorities? Jonathan Wilkinson is the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard, and he joins us from Vancouver. Minister, I'd like to start with this climate change report that was done for the Treasury Board. Your government requested the analysis, so what do you plan to do with it?
Well, I mean, what we asked the Canadian Council of Academies to do was to actually look at the risks associated with climate change, the level of severity of the risk, and the implications in terms of how could we adapt to some of the changes that we are going to see. It is really important information. I think it's a very thoughtful report, which highlights a number of areas where we really need to think very carefully about how we're going to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Some of that work is already underway. I can tell you certainly within my department, we're thinking a lot about how we protect, for example, small craft harbors in the context of changing climate conditions. And some of it we're going to need to do some further thinking about as we move forward. But I think what the report underlines is climate change is not a future issue. It is an issue that is impacting us now. We are seeing increasing impacts associated with the climate issue, and what that really screams for is we need to have a thoughtful and credible climate plan that has 2 components. One is how are we going to mitigate and reduce our emissions so that we're not making the problem worse? And the second is how are we going to actually adapt to some of the changes that are already baked in? And that means that climate change is one of the issues that I think Canadians will ensure that we are talking about as we move forward to October, because it is such an important issue.
So what specifically is your government going to do to make sure that this report doesn't end up gathering dust on a shelf somewhere?
Well, I will tell you that certainly with respect to my department, and I know this will be true with other ministers, we will be taking this as an input to policy development going forward. Good public policy development requires evidence. This is evidence and data that we can use to help us to ensure that we are taking account of the risks associated with climate. And the inevitability of some of these things means that we have to build them into our planning around, building infrastructure in the north, small craft harbors on the East Coast, and some of the areas where answers are more difficult, like ecosystem changes, and how do you mitigate those? How do you adapt to a changing climate? Those are far more complicated. But again, I just think it underlines how important this issue is and how important it is that anybody who aspires to be Prime Minister in this country has a thoughtful, comprehensive, and credible climate plan.
You mentioned some of the blunt warnings in this report, and the number one issue this raises is risks to infrastructure and, buildings, houses, hospitals, and Canadians who have lived through extreme weather experiences in the past know how difficult and how expensive it can be to go through that process. But do you have a general sense as to whether Canadians take a look at reports like this, or where Canadians think that these concerns, that they're a real problem?
Well, I think increasingly Canadians are becoming more and more cognizant of reports like this, of the issues associated with it. And I think it comes home to roost often when you start to think about, the cost of insurance, where insurers are increasingly taking climate impacts and potential climate impacts into account when they're actually establishing premiums. You know, when we look at what happened in Calgary or several years ago, or in Quebec more recently, or the Atlantic provinces, when we start to see issues in the north around infrastructure where we're starting to have the issue of permafrost melting, I think it's becoming increasingly more present in our day-to-day lives, and it's going to become increasingly more present in our pocketbooks on a go-forward basis. And I think that will be an impetus for people to stop and say, wow, this really, really has to be a priority for government to start to actually A, mitigate, and B, spend thoughtful time thinking about how we best adapt.
So when you hear criticism from people like Elizabeth May, who says that your climate plan doesn't go far enough, you're receiving a report like this, you're treating it as a very credible, scientific-based report. Does that not mean your government needs to do more to strengthen your plan going forward?
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, our plan is a comprehensive approach as to how we meet the Paris Agreement targets. And it is about starting the transformation of our economy. It's about actually building out electric infrastructure. It's about changing the way in which we generate power. And those kinds of things take some time. But I certainly agree with Ms. May that as we move beyond 2030 to 2050, the kinds of reductions that we're going to need to see are going to be significantly more. And you know, I certainly agree with Ms. May that this is a climate emergency. I think that perhaps, you know, Ms. May is a little bit optimistic in terms of the ability to transform some of these fundamental infrastructure programs in a shorter period of time. But I think in terms of the long-term objective, I am entirely aligned with her. This is an emergency. We need to take action.
That's Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister of Fisheries and Oceans in the Canadian Coast Guard. He's reacting to a report out today on the top threats to Canada caused by climate change. It was commissioned by the Federal Treasury Board, and it identifies a dozen areas put at highest risk by climate change. Will the report change the approach to climate change and efforts to deal with its effects? Or will it be simply used as a political tool on all sides of this issue? It's time for the Power Panel in Toronto. Melissa Lantzman of Hill & Knowlton Strategies. Alongside her is former Saskatchewan Finance Minister Andrew Thompson, who is now Chief of Government Relations for the University of Toronto. And in Montreal, former Quebec Liberal Cabinet Minister David Ertel. Now, the report ranks what is most threatened by climate change, and at the top is infrastructure, things like hospitals, roads, bridges, power grids, and then comes in coastal communities and northerners. I want to start with David. Will the findings light a fire under people? Will the public take this seriously?
Well, I think the fire's already lit, quite honestly. I think right now what you're seeing is that the people that are seeing climate change as a key issue going into the election already know the risk, already know about these issues. Like in Quebec, for example, we just had historic flooding for the second time in 3 years. We've seen the wildfires out west. We've seen the impacts. Right now, it's 40 degrees outside in Montreal today. And so we know these things. I think right now, I feel that the timing of the report is kind of off. I would have liked to see the report come a bit earlier so the Liberals could have made some hay out of this. This morning, the Prime Minister was in Montreal to announce $1.3 billion in public transit. No real link between that investment and the importance of fighting climate change. So I'm kind of seeing a lot of mixed messages, and this report not being used as much as it could be.
But my question from there would be, and I'll put this to Melissa, you know, if this report had come earlier and the Liberals could have made some hay with it, would that not neutralize any scientific value it might have and therefore be seen as a political and a partisan document rather than perhaps a scientific evidence-based study into what could happen if these risks aren't mitigated?
I think it's hard to see anything as not a political document when we're less than 4 months away from an election, because I think any document that is brought forward by a report that's commissioned by the government for the government is exactly that. It's political. I think that we've got to ask ourselves: is this artificially raising the temperature on people saying that the environment is at the top of their list of issues when it comes to their voting intentions? And more so, I think you see the Liberals moving away, from necessarily talking about a carbon tax every single day to single-use plastics, ban on single-use plastics and recycling, because the carbon tax just isn't that popular, and I imagine that they're seeing that in their numbers.
Andrew, to you, do you think that this report is going to be viewed as a partisan political document?
No, I actually don't think it will be. My sense is this just goes on the very growing heap of documents that are coming out that show that climate change is real. And in many ways, I think Canadian politicians of all stripes have kind of moved beyond that debate. There's certainly some on the fringe who are certainly arguing against it, but all the mainstream parties seem now to be accepting that we are in a period of climate change, of global warming, and that we're needing to address something. The piece, though, that is worrisome is that there are not really very many credible plans out there being advanced by the political parties to address any of this. Discussions about banning plastic straws and buying pipelines is not a coherent policy for fighting climate change. And simply worrying about how we're going to invest more in green technology with offsets from what is essentially a carbon tax, is a slightly better approach that the Conservatives have. But again, doesn't get us anywhere close to meeting the targets that are going to need to be addressed. That's the piece that I think is very worrisome, is that we're allowing the politicians right now, the public is, to get away with these kind of putting shiny things in the window to distract our attention without really addressing the heart of the matter, which is what is their plan to help us meet the targets for reducing global warming. So
back to you, Andrew, how does that conversation shift? What needs to happen to get that conversation to go to the place where politicians are taking a serious look at plans that they may need to come up with to mitigate the risks that are highlighted in this document?
So this document actually does help, I think, in some ways in doing that, and that is about putting an appropriate frame around these policy pieces. What needs to be done to actually address the global warming versus what is there for other environmental measures. We have gotten way too caught up on the question of whether a very low dollar value carbon tax is a tax on people or whether it's a measure which is going to fix the environmental problem. We're in this ridiculous debate about banning plastic straws as if that has anything to do with climate change. Not to say it doesn't have to do with recycling and that that's not an important environmental objective, but it doesn't have anything to do with climate change. And what we need, I think, to start doing is getting into these issues of here are 5 areas that need to be addressed if we're going to get serious about tackling climate change. And that's what this type of report can do. But right now, the parties really have free rein to put up whatever they want. And for the electorate to kind of just shrug and go, I don't think any of it's going to be effective.
Melissa, do you agree with Andrew's assessment there about the debate around the carbon tax at this point?
Absolutely. I think we've taken the debate to the lowest common denominator, but that's to say that the carbon tax was never a good idea at actually mitigating climate change. It doesn't meet its targets. We don't know how much it costs, and it's punitive on on mothers who take their kids to hockey practice. So it's not a good political issue. And on top of that, it doesn't solve the environmental problem. And I do agree with Andrew that we should start having a serious conversation. And I do think this report actually it looks at sort of the different ways that we can talk about climate change, but we're not doing that because we're in an election and because this report is going to be seen as political.
David, to you, do you think that when Canadians take a look at this, and whether it's studies coming out, there are so many studies that come out on this issue. Are Canadians being overwhelmed by this, that there are so many things here that they're not necessarily paying attention, that, this might be full of some very serious warnings and blunt, direct warnings about, if we don't take care of these issues now in terms of preparing for, flooding, or whether it's dealing with coastal communities, there's just an abundance of information that it's so overwhelming that Canadians just see it as another study that's going to gather dust on a shelf, and it too shall pass. Is there do you see that's something that exists within the public right now?
I think that's a valid point, Katie. I think people are beyond being sensitized about the fact that climate change is real. As Andrew was saying, everybody pretty much knows and accepts it. Now the real challenge is, what are the parties going to do to change the people's lives directly. We can talk about macro principles and flooding and talk about the importance of investing, but how is it going to change my direct life? What can I do to help? What can government do? And the last 4 years, we've had a lot of talk, but not a lot of action. And that's the issue right now, because I remember the Liberal government just after the 2015 election coming into Paris with a lot of momentum, and when you look at the past years now, there isn't much real action that has changed. We haven't evolved a lot. So yes, we can talk about studies, we can talk about more data, people are feeling it, they're seeing it in their daily lives, but now, as Melissa was saying, we're going into an election cycle, everybody has their plan, everybody has their spin, but at the same time, people are saying, okay, I get it, but what are we going to do really now, concretely, beyond the plastic straws?
All right, we're going to leave this part of the conversation there.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.